It is just after 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of April, 1865. A wooden paddle steamer is fighting her way up the Mississippi River against a flood-swollen current in the dark 7 miles north of Memphis. She is carrying, by the most reliable estimates, more than 2,100 human beings. Her legal capacity is 376. Almost all of them are asleep. Most of them are soldiers in the Army of the United States, weeks out of Confederate prison camps that had nearly killed them. Most of them have been walking dead for months. They have survived starvation. They have survived disease. They have survived camps where 1 in 4 men died of hunger before he could be released. And the first time in a very long time, they are going home. Their officers have telegraphed their families. Their wives know to expect them. Their mothers have written letters that will arrive after the funerals. In the next 10 seconds, one of the 4 boilers of this paddle steamer is going to explode. The blast will tear the superstructure of the ship apart. It will throw men sleeping into the cold river. It will set the wreck on fire. It will kill, in the next hours, more Americans than the sinking of the Titanic would kill. Half a century later, by the time the sun comes up, somewhere between 1,400 and 1,700 people will be dead. You have almost certainly never heard of any of them. This is the story of the SS Sultana, the worst maritime disaster in the history of the United States, the deadliest peacetime shipping accident in American history, and the catastrophe a nation chose, almost the moment it happened, to forget. But to understand what occurred on the river that night, you have to know 3 things. The first is what these men had already survived: the prison camps, the hunger, the years they had been written off as dead by people back home. The second is the deal that a steamboat captain made with the United States Army to put 6 times the legal number of human beings on a wooden boat with a cracked boiler. The deal that, by most surviving accounts, involved bribes paid in the back rooms of Vicksburg, Mississippi. And the third, violence. The reason you have never heard of the Sultana, even though she killed more of her own countrymen than any single Civil War battle except for a handful, is not an accident. It is a very specific accident of timing. 3 things. Listen carefully. It begins in the spring of 1865 in a country coming apart. For 4 years, the United States had been at war with itself. By the spring of that year, more than 600,000 of its young men had been killed in combat or had died of disease in army camps. There was almost no town in the country that had not buried someone. And in the closing weeks of that war, with the Confederate armies surrendering one by one, the survivors began to come home. Some came home easily. They walked out of camps near where they had been fighting. They caught trains. They walked into kitchens that their mothers had not stopped lighting for them in 4 years. Others came home much harder. There were, by April of 1865, tens of thousands of Union soldiers held in Confederate prison camps. The most infamous of these was a place called Camp Sumter in Georgia, which the men inside called Andersonville. Andersonville is a name worth remembering because it sits at the center of this story. It was a holding camp for captured Union soldiers, opened in 1864. By the end of the war, it had held tens of thousands of prisoners in conditions that, by any honest measure, were a slow execution. There was not enough food. There was not enough clean water. There was not enough shelter from the Georgia summer. By the most reliable figures, of the roughly 45,000 Union soldiers who passed through Andersonville, around 13,000 died there. Almost 1 in 3, they starved. They contracted dysentery, scurvy, typhoid. They lay in the open mud and slowly stopped being able to stand up. Their bodies were buried in long trenches outside the stockade walls, in numbered graves whose names, in many cases, were not recorded. The men who survived Andersonville came out, in the spring of 1865, looking like nothing American newspapers had ever printed. There are photographs of them. The photographs are not easy to look at. They are men whose ribs are visible through their skin, have stopped focusing on the lens. Men weighing 80 pounds, 90 pounds, who had weighed 170 before the war. These are the men who are now being put onto a paddle steamer. I want you to imagine one of them. The dead of the Sultana came from Ohio, from Indiana, from Kentucky, from Tennessee, from West Virginia. There are roughly 1,000 names on the casualty lists, and the lists are incomplete. So let us imagine, instead of all of them, one. He will be representative. Many were like him. He is a young man, 23 years old, from a farm in southern Ohio. He had enlisted in 1862, full of the seriousness that boys his age fall into when their country is at war. He had fought in 2 battles, neither of them famous now. In the second of them, in 1864, he had been captured. He had spent the next 11 months in Andersonville. When he is paroled, in the spring of 1865, he weighs 93 pounds. He has lost 3 of his teeth. He has not seen his mother in 3 years. He has not slept under a roof in 12 months. He cannot, the doctors at the parolee camp note, walk for more than a few minutes at a time without sitting down. His name does not matter. His mother's name does. She is at home in Ohio, lighting a lamp every evening and putting it in the front window. He is told in the 3rd week of April that he is going home. He is loaded onto a train and then onto a steamboat to take him up the Mississippi River to Cairo, Illinois, and from there north and east to home. The steamboat is called the Sultana. She is a side-wheel paddle steamer. Built 2 years earlier in Cincinnati, 260 feet long. By the standards of riverboats in 1865, she is large, modern, and reasonably well appointed. She has 3 decks. She has cabins for paying passengers and open space for cargo. She has in her belly 4 enormous iron boilers fed by wood-burning fires that turn river water into the high-pressure steam that drives her paddle wheels. She is rated to carry, by the surviving records, 376 passengers in safety. On the morning of the 24th of April, 1865, she begins taking board at Vicksburg, Mississippi. More than 2,000 human beings. Stop. Read that number again, more than 2,000. By many accounts, the figure was somewhere between 2,100 and 2,400. The exact count was never made because there was no time. The men were marched onto her decks in long, ragged columns, more than 5 times her legal capacity, until she was, by witnesses on the dock, visibly sagging in the water. Men were packed onto every deck. Men were leaning against railings that, by sober standards, shouldn't have held that weight. Her captain knew. Her crew knew. The Union Army officers who had loaded her knew. They did it anyway. The reason, by most accounts, was money. In the spring of 1865, the United States Army was paying private steamboat companies to transport paroled soldiers home from the South. The Army was paying per soldier. The more soldiers a boat carried, the more the boat's owners earned. The captain of the Sultana, a man named James Cass Mason, was, by the surviving evidence, in financial trouble. He had part ownership of the boat. He was, like many wartime captains, looking for a payout. And there were people in the Army's logistical chain at Vicksburg who, by the testimony that came out afterward, were willing to direct soldiers onto a particular boat rather than spread them across many. 2 other steamboats were in port at Vicksburg those days, with capacity to take some of the men. The men were instead funneled, almost all of them, onto the Sultana. The story of exactly who took how much, and from whom would, in the years that followed, become a swamp of testimony, partial confessions, and accusations that were never fully resolved. But the result that anyone could see was simple. The Sultana alone took on a load that should have gone to 3 boats, and no authority to stop it stopped it. There is one more piece you need to know. Before she loaded the soldiers, the Sultana had a problem. One of her 4 boilers had developed a bulge in its iron plating. To anyone who understood steam engineering, this was a serious matter. A bulged boiler was a boiler that had been stressed past its design. The right repair was to remove the affected plate and build in a new one. The proper repair would take several days. The captain did not want several days. He had soldiers waiting to be loaded. The repair the Sultana actually received in Vicksburg was a temporary patch, a thinner sheet of iron bolted over the bulge to hold the pressure long enough to finish the journey. It was the kind of repair that an experienced river engineer would, in better times, have called a stopgap. Not a solution, a way to keep going for one more trip. The Sultana left Vicksburg on the night of the 24th of April with more than 2,000 human beings on board and a patched boiler in her engine room. Now, I want you to think about what was happening. Outside of 14th of April, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, had been shot in a theater in Washington. He had died the next morning. The nation was in a state of grief and political shock that the older Americans alive that year had never experienced and would not see again in their lifetimes. Massive manhunt was underway across the eastern United States for Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Newspapers in every city were running every day, almost nothing else. Where was Booth? Who had helped him? What would the punishment be? Would the South be allowed back into the Union, or punished for what its sympathizers had done? On the 26th of April, 1865, the same day the Sultana was beginning to steam up the Mississippi from Vicksburg. Fully loaded, John Wilkes Booth was cornered in a barn in Virginia by Union cavalry. He was shot and killed there. The country, which had been waiting for that news for 12 days, now had it. This is the most important sentence in everything you are about to hear. The day Booth was killed was the day the Sultana was steaming north. The day after Booth's body was being photographed and identified in Washington was the day the Sultana would explode. The country was looking at a barn in Virginia. It was not looking at a river in Tennessee. For the men on the Sultana, the journey upriver was, despite the crowding, a kind of paradise. They had food. There was not much of it, and it was strange to the stomachs of men who had been starving for a year. But it was real food. They had clean water. They had sky above them and a river under them, and they were moving slowly, kilometer by kilometer, toward home. Some of them did not even mind the crowding. They had been packed into worse spaces. The deck of a riverboat, even an overloaded one, was a sky-roofed palace compared to the inside of Andersonville. The young man from Ohio, the one we are imagining, is on the upper deck. He has found a spot near the stern, where he can lean against a railing and watch the river. He cannot sleep much. He has not slept much for almost a year. But he kissed, and he can think about what his mother's face will look like when he walks up the dirt road to the farm. He thinks, on the night of the 26th, that he might be home in a week, maybe 10 days. The boat moves slowly. The Mississippi is at flood stage. Some of the side channels are 40 feet above their normal levels. The current is strong. The water is cold and high. And a fully loaded steamer struggling upstream against it is going to make slow progress. At about 2 in the morning, on the 27th of April, the Sultana is roughly 7 miles north of Memphis, in a wide stretch of the river. Most of the men on board are asleep. The boilers are working hard, pushing steam at full pressure, fighting the current, and then one of them lets go. What happens in the next 30 seconds is what would, in the inquest that followed, be a matter of dispute. Witnesses' accounts vary. The boilers themselves were destroyed in the event. What can be said with some confidence is this: one of the 4 boilers, by most accounts the one that had been patched in Vicksburg, failed under pressure. The patch or the metal around it gave way. The boiler ruptured. Hundreds of pounds per square inch of superheated steam blew outward, in a fraction of a second, into the compartments above. The men who were closest to it died almost immediately. The blast pressure alone was enough to kill a man at close range. The steam, at the temperature it had been carrying, did the rest. A boiler explosion of that scale is not a single shock. It triggers other things. The other boilers, suddenly out of balance, ruptured in the same minute. The wooden superstructure of the ship, sitting directly over the boilers, was blown apart. The forward part of the upper deck collapsed. Pieces of the ship, large pieces, sections of deck, broken timbers, parts of the smokestacks, were thrown into the night air and came down across the river over a wide area. Men who had been sleeping on the foredeck were thrown into the water. Men who had been below were trapped under the collapsing structure above, and the fire began. The Sultana, like every wooden steamboat of her age, was full of materials that would burn enthusiastically. Wood, tar, cotton bales for cargo, the pitch, oil and stored fuel of the engineering compartments. Within minutes, the center of the boat was a furnace. There were, by most estimates, 2,000 human beings on this burning wreck, in the middle of a wide flooded river in the dark. At 2 in the morning, some of them died in the explosion itself. Some died in the fire. Many, by all accounts a very large number, went into the water to escape the fire and died there. The Mississippi in late April was cold. Not freezing, but cold enough to kill a healthy man in hours if he could not get out. And these men were not healthy. They were the survivors of Andersonville. Many of them could barely swim on a good day. Some could not swim at all. Many had been weakened by months of starvation to a point where their bodies in cold water simply gave out. The young man on the upper deck, the one we are imagining, was lucky enough to be at the stern, away from the worst of the blast. The first thing he knew of what was happening was the noise. Air noise that did not have a name. Then a thump in his chest like a closed door slamming. Then darkness, smoke screaming, and the upper deck under his feet beginning to tilt. He could not see in the smoke what had become of the front of the ship. He could hear men in the water. He could see by the firelight beginning to spread that the deck below his was already collapsing. He went into the river. He had to. The boat was burning. He was by his weight almost incapable of swimming. He grabbed for a piece of floating wood. There were others trying to grab the same piece. He held on. The current took him. He survived because the piece of wood did not turn over, and because some hours later, a small commercial boat picked him out of the river and put him into a blanket and took him to a hospital in Memphis. He survived because of the kind of dumb luck that survival in disasters always seems to require. His shipmates, 1,000, did not. The first rescue boats reached the Sultana about an hour after the explosion. By then, the boat was on fire from end to end, and the survivors were scattered across miles of dark, fast-moving river. Crews on the surface did what they could. They pulled men out of the water. They picked up floating debris to which men were still clinging. Bodies were recovered. In the days and weeks that followed, downriver as far as Vicksburg, hundreds of miles south of where the boat had been, some bodies were never recovered. The Mississippi at flood is a hard place to find a body. The official death toll, as recorded by the United States Army shortly afterward, was around 1,100. Modern historians, looking again at the loading manifests and the survivor accounts, have put the figure significantly higher. Most modern estimates land somewhere between 1,400 and 1,700 dead. That figure, even at the low end, is greater than the death toll of the sinking of the RMS Titanic, almost half a century later. Titanic killed roughly 1,500. Sultana, by most modern counts, killed any. By some accounts, considerably more. The Sultana is, by any honest count, the worst maritime disaster in American history. And now we come to the silence. The Sultana exploded on the 27th of April, 1865. John Wilkes Booth had been killed the day before. The country's newspapers in those days ran with what they had. And what they had that week was the closing of the Lincoln assassination story. The Sultana made the news. She had to. A disaster of that scale, on a river that carried American commerce, could not be hidden. But the news of her was, in most papers, a single column on an inside page. The headline: Lincoln, Booth, the plot, the reckoning. The country had no room left. 4 years of mass death, a president murdered, an assassin dead in a barn, a war ending, the collapse of one half of the country into political chaos, reconstruction beginning. The American press, the American public, the American government had, by the spring of 1865, simply run out of attention for any more dying. And the men who had died on the Sultana, in the calculus that newspapers and governments use, even when they do not say so out loud, were the kind of men whose deaths could be quietly absorbed. They were not officers. They were not famous. They were thin, enlisted men from small farms in the Ohio Valley who had survived a Confederate prison and almost made it home. There were investigations. The Army convened a court of inquiry. There were findings about the boilers. There was testimony about the bribery in Vicksburg, but no one was convicted of anything significant. Captain Mason, who might have been the obvious target, was dead. He had died in his own boat. The officers in Vicksburg who had taken the bribes denied taking them, or could not be conclusively proven to have taken them, or had moved on in the post-war chaos, to places where the Army could not easily find them. There were no executions, no long prison sentences, no memorials built by the federal government, no long-running congressional hearings. The Sultana disappeared into a footnote. Today, if you go to Memphis, you can find traces of what happened. There is a small memorial. There is a museum in a town across the river that the energy of a few dedicated families keeps the story alive. There are every year on the 27th of April, ceremonies attended by a small number of descendants and historians. The Sultana Memorial draws, in a good year, perhaps a few hundred visitors on the anniversary. The graves of the men who died are scattered. Some are in national cemeteries, Many are in family plots in small Ohio and Kentucky towns, with dates on the stones that match, 27th of April, 1865, but with no story carved beside them. The young man from Ohio, the one we imagined, did not exist. But men like him existed in their thousands. Ames. They had mothers who lit lamps in front windows. They had farms and small towns to come back to. And most of them, in the dark of April 27th, did not come back. If there is a lesson in the Sultana, it is one that the country has had to learn, over and over, ever since. Bad timing kills more stories than bad evidence does. The men on the Sultana died at a moment when the country, exhausted by other deaths, did not have any grief left to give them. The bribes that put them on the boat were forgotten because the men who took those bribes were small fish in a wartime ocean, and the country was hunting larger ones. The patched boiler that finally killed them was a footnote in an inquiry that no one had time to read, and the wreck of the Sultana, somewhere in the Mississippi flats, was buried in the decades that followed. Under decades of silt as the river changed course, she is still there. Some of her, anyway. The exact site has been argued over for years. For the men who went down with her on the cold flood current April night in 1865, the world they died in had already moved on. The newspapers were full of an assassin and a martyred president. The trains were full of soldiers coming home by other routes. The mothers in Ohio and Indiana and Kentucky and Tennessee, with their lamps in their front windows, were waiting. Some of those lamps were lit on those windowsills for weeks, some of them for months. Some, by the accounts of family letters that survived, were never put out at all. The men those lamps were lit for were in the river. Smoke, iron, and silence.